Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming in for this session that I am very particularly excited for. This is one of the few times where I actually get to lead off by thanking one of our sponsors and actually go into one of them. But of course, we're grateful to the Ribera Law Firm, the Lamothe Law Firm, and NK Safety Net for their help putting this conference on, and of course, Mitch Garabedian. Mitchell Garabedian is an internationally recognized attorney and advocate for victims and survivors of sexual abuse. He began practicing law in 1979 and became widely known and respected for his representation of victims and survivors of Roman Catholic Church clergy sexual abuse in the 90s and 2000s. To date, the law office of Mitchell Garabedian has represented more than 2,500 victims and survivors of clergy sexual abuse and hundreds of other victims and survivors of abuse by those in the Boy Scouts, private schools, and other organizations. And one little thing I might add, I just learned last night, Mitch has been played by not one A-list, but two A-list Hollywood actors. So he has that distinction for our speakers as well. With that, go ahead, Mitch, and take it away.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Snap, for allowing me to speak today. I'm going to talk about the legal process and how to proceed through the legal process and the different compensation programs and mediation programs. I'll try to touch upon many bases, and it's an honor to speak to you, to all the survivors today. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to represent you and to be able to stand on your shoulders, to make change, and to help survivors regain self-esteem and self-respect. You should be proud of yourselves. It takes a lot of courage to come forward. I'm proud of you, and it's an honor to work with you, and it's an honor to speak to you today. Many times I'm confronted with a client or an individual who asks me, do I go through the compensation program some states have, or do I litigate? And really what it always comes down to is, how is the survivor, the clergy sexual abuse survivor, validated? It's a personal decision. It's an intensely personal decision made by each and every survivor based on a various factors. Compensation programs, such as we've had in New York or New Jersey or other states, Arizona, Colorado, they will listen to the damages, they will listen to the injuries, they will listen to the causation that a survivor has, they will listen to the survivor's history and the nature of the abuse and how many times a person was abused, sexually abused, over what course of time, and how that's affected the survivor, whether it be through whether the damages be through, as we all know, lack of self-esteem, lack of self-respect, lack of trust, anger, anxiety, depression, sadness. I mean, the damages are endless. And then they'll award a sum to the survivor, which the survivor does not have to accept. They can choose to litigate in most instances. If that helps you as a survivor to accept that amount of money and move on with your life in lieu of protracted litigation, then that's something you seriously want to consider. It's all about validation. We all know, and I've been representing victims for more than 25 years and survivors for more than 25 years, clergy sexual abuse victims and survivors. We all know that there isn't any amount of money in the world that ever could give back to you what was stolen from you as an innocent child. You would exchange any amount of money in the world for not having been sexually abused as an innocent child and as an adult. And some survivors are sexually abused by clergy as adults. So you have to make a decision. Do I want to litigate, or do I want to go through the compensation program? Do I want to spend the next 3 years litigating, approximately 3 years, or do I want to accept this amount of money and settle my claim? Do I feel validated? Do I get that sense that the church, the supervisor of the church, the Pope, the cardinals, that they now own it? They're responsible. They're never going to admit that. We all know that. They give us these superficial words of, well, we feel bad and we did bad things in the past, but we've changed. And we all know that's a bunch of baloney, because they don't institute the programs behind those words, and they don't make sure those programs are instituted. So you have to make a decision whether it's worth it. On the other side of the coin, for instance, we have litigation. Litigation is very complicated. Litigation is opening up across the country because of statute of limitations opening up across the country. And when you file a complaint, you are going to be living with that case for at least 3 years, and you've lived with the sexual abuse your whole life. For those of you have had suppressed memory, if you've had repressed memory, you've been living with it since the memories came back. And it's very important that you understand what is involved in litigation. A complaint is filed after at least I believe, after your historical records are collected. And a complaint is filed, and it may get media attention, it may not get media attention. And you have an attorney filing a suit for you, and you should speak to that attorney and ask that attorney, is my name going to be out there? Am I going to be named public? And many individuals, many survivors who are courageous in coming forward in the first place haven't taken that step yet where they want their name out there. But some have, and some don't care, and they want their name out there. But if you don't want your name out there publicly, you can be called in Jane Doe or John Doe. There's court procedures where you can be called Jane Doe or John Doe. And it's more than your name being hidden, it's your identity being hidden. And why is that important to many survivors? Well, it's not only because you're not ready to have your name out there for your own personal benefit, for your own personal reasons, but you may not want your family implicated, or you may not want your family to know about the sexual abuse yet. So you have to take it a step at a time. It's very, very important that you take it a step at a time. And you, as a survivor, realize that you have to take care of yourself first and foremost. You have to take care of your mental health first and foremost. It's very important that you understand that, because you're in charge, and no one can take that away from you now. You've come forward. You're strong. You're resilient. You're brave. You're courageous. It takes an enormous amount of courage to come forward. And in coming forward and reporting your sexual abuse, you're not only empowering yourselves, but you're empowering other victims, and you're making the world a safer place for children. There's no doubt about that. We've seen that time and again. How many times has a survivor come forward, reported being sexually abused by a priest, and all of a sudden other survivors come forward and say, me too. I thought I was the only one. Me too. Now, that transparency will help you and help others and protect children. And once the lawsuit begins, the other side, the church officials, the supervisors, through their lawyers, are not going to be kind. They're going to try to uncover anything they can about you. They'll look at your historical records. And your lawyer, before filing suit, should collect your historical records such as education records, criminal records, employment records, therapy records, counseling records, various records. That your whole life is out there. And you have to be ready for that. And you have to be strong. But remember, the church and those criminal priests are afraid of you. You should not be afraid of them. They're afraid of you. The evil they committed is unspeakable, and the crimes they've committed through the sexual abuse and the cover-up is horrible. We all know that, and we have to keep this movement going. So your records will be reviewed, all of your records, the good, the bad, and the ugly. No one is perfect. No one has led a perfect life. And there'll be various arguments in your lawsuit, such as the statute of limitations, such as prior notice. Did the supervisors know that the perpetrating priest, the sexual abuser, was a sexual abuser before he sexually abused you? very important. There'll be First Amendment issues about the freedom of religion and the Establishment Clause and the ability to prevent the plaintiff, prevent you from proceeding because they want to hide under the First Amendment. In Boston, in the 1990s, with the Father Gagan cases, we used to fight the First Amendment all the time, and we were fortunate we had a judge who was fair and reasonable. And when there are First Amendment arguments, the First Amendment protects religion, except when there's wrongful conduct. And that is only within the last 30 or 40 years. Before then, you couldn't go after a religion. You couldn't go after the Catholic Church or any other religion, even if there was wrongful conduct. First Amendment says that a religion can believe what they want to believe. They can believe anything they want to believe. If they want to stand on a chair on their head and worship a pencil, they can do that. It's not the government's job to get involved in that. And they can conduct themselves any way they want to. In that example, they can stand on a chair and on their head. That's fine. But when it comes to wrongful conduct that is illegal, for instance, the government get involved. That's what we used in the 1990s. That's the argument we used in the 1990s to get to the secret files, to get to the documents the Catholic Church has. That's why the First Amendment argument is so important, in addition to your case just being thrown out because a judge says, well, you can't look into the activities of religion. That ship has sailed. You want to look, you want to file a suit, and you want to, when you file a suit, you want to get evidence that the church knew what was going on. And I'll use Boston as an example again. It took us 3.5 years to get to the secret files, the canon law 489 files. They're called secret files, or they're called secret archives. It took us 3.5 years to get to those documents. When we got to those documents, when we obtained those documents, we showed that Bernard Cardinal Law was a criminal. We showed that Father Gagan was sexually abusing children. He had notice, Bernard Cardinal Law had notice of it, yet Bernard Cardinal Law sent Father Gagan to St. Julia's Church in Western Massachusetts, right outside of Boston, where Gagan continued to sexually abuse children. And after that, Gagan was in a retirement home down the street from my office, and he was abusing children. So Bernard Cardinal Law did not warn the public about Father Gagan. He did not call the police, and he should have. And children were sexually abused. And in those documents, it showed activity, the sexually abusive activity that Bernard Cardinal Law knew Father Gagan was sexually abusing children. Very important information. And there were records about treatment centers in there. We all know about treatment centers. Treatment centers are where priests are sent under the title of alcoholism or temper tantrums or whatever. They're really sexual abusers. And they're treated in these treatment centers. And there's 4 in the United States and one in Canada. And there are other smaller treatment centers. But we showed that Gagan was in a treatment center. He was repeatedly in a treatment center for pedophilia. Yet Bernard Cardinal Law sent him out to the public and did not warn the public, did not warn parents, did not even call the police. So it's very important when you're litigating that your lawyers, that you proceed to get the secret files, that you fight First Amendment arguments. And why did it take 3.5 years in Boston? Because I got the personnel files of Gagan, but they weren't the secret files. And it showed some conduct problems. And I'd go back to court and I'd say, Judge, I want more files because these are leading us to other files that we don't have. And the judge would say, you're right. But after 3.5 years, we got the secret files. And also, you can use those secret files, or the government can use those secret files in a criminal case. Father Gagan was prosecuted in Boston, and he received a 10-year jail sentence, a maximum jail sentence. Father Gagan was in the records. It showed in the treatment center with psychiatrists, with therapists, it showed that Father Gagan admitted sexually abusing 3 or 4 children, but he didn't think there was anything wrong with that. amazing that his supervisors would cover that up, and Father Gagan will be sexually abusing children in such a wholesale fashion. And I'm probably not telling many viewers what they already don't know, but I'm explaining why some aspects of the legal process and why you want to go through these steps. It's just very important that you understand where your case is going. And we all know that one priest who has sexually abused an innocent child has probably sexually abused hundreds upon hundreds of innocent children. And survivors must come forward to stop this abuse. It must be stopped. Now, the criminal prosecution would require a survivor to take the stand and testify. For instance, I represent a brave survivor in Boston where Cardinal McCarrick was just charged criminally, and he's ready to take the stand and he's ready to testify. And some of you have probably seen the McCarrick report out of the Vatican, which is sanitized. But McCarrick was such a powerful man that the CIA, and I believe it's footnote 34 of the report, the CIA, the FBI wanted to recruit McCarrick to be a counterintelligence agent and infiltrate the KBG. Now, this man, this pedophile priest, Cardinal McCarrick, used to hobnob with President George W. Bush, President Clinton, President Nixon. He used to be with the presidents. This is how powerful this man was, this pedophile, this criminal, this child molester. But it's because of the brave courage of survivors like yourselves that we're revealing the ugly truth about clergy sexual abuse and how it's gone all the way up the ranks. There are other bishops in the country named in civil cases. I represent victims against Bishop McGann, for instance. There are, and because of your courage, advocates like SNAP, great organization, advocates are able to stand on your shoulders, and lawyers are able to stand on your shoulders and be a voice with you. Your voices cannot be silenced. Your voices will not be silenced. So your criminal case is proceeding. Now, there'll be depositions. There'll be depositions of priests. There'll be depositions of priests who are supervisors. There'll be documents produced. And I think it's very important that you work with your lawyer so that you tell your lawyer what you know about this particular priest, or what you knew about that particular parish, or what you know about the particular chancery, for instance, so that he can get or she can get an idea of how the structure, the power structure was at that institution. Because often a pastor would cover up a pedophile priest, or if the pastor was the pedophile, his supervisor would cover it up in a certain way. And many parents, we know this, would tell pastors that their children were abused, and the pastor would tell the child, tell the parent, keep it a secret. You don't want to ruin the reputation of the church. What reputation? This is ridiculous. And secrecy, as we all know, and I'll get off track a little bit here, is the common thread which allowed clergy sexual abuse to occur through the use of confidentiality agreements, for instance. As you know, when the child sexually abuses a survivor, when the priest sexually abuses a survivor, the priest tells the child, you will keep this a secret, or your parents will be punished. You have to keep this a secret, or you'll be thrown out of school. You have to keep this a secret, or your parents will be divorced. Or you have to keep this a secret, or you will be harmed. And the child, as a child, believes that. And then when a parent told the pastor, as I mentioned earlier, the pastor would tell the parent, you have to keep this secret for the sake of the church. And canon law states, when clergy sexual abuse matters are looked into, they shall be kept secret. So secrecy is the common thread, and that's what you're breaking by coming forward. And even if you go through the compensation program, you can still, there are no confidentiality agreements involved in these compensation programs. You can out the pedophile priests, you can out the supervisors who allowed the pedophilia to occur. As survivors, you do what validates you, what makes you feel whole, what makes you feel strong, what brings you back to strength, because the courage you're showing is enormous. You may not see that when you look in the mirror, but you should see that. You should be so very proud of yourselves to come forward. It takes an enormous amount of courage. I know some of you have waited decades upon decades upon decades. Some of you are 80 and 70 and 80 years old. But by coming forward, as I've said a couple times, you're empowering yourself, you're empowering other victims, and you're making a world a safe place for children. And you will be deposed during your litigation. You will be asked questions by lawyers across the table from you. And your lawyer, will be protecting you legally. And what do you have to do? You have to tell the truth. The truth works. Just tell what happened. That your life is no longer a secret. They can ask you all kinds of questions because of emotional distress claims. And you just tell the truth, because the truth will work in these cases. It always does. It works in every case, any kind of case. They cannot, the church cannot handle the ugly truth about these cases. And the lawyer deposing you will have your historical documents, your educational history, your employment history, and your criminal history or lack of criminal history, for instance. And your history is not going to be perfect, because you all know as survivors, you've had a tough road emotionally throughout your lives. Survivors, we all know, love to run in their minds. They run. They run from job to job to job to job. Survivors sometimes have 60 or 70 jobs. That's nothing to be ashamed about. When those records are produced, that supports the fact you were sexually abused. That supports the fact you had emotional problems. That supports the fact that you're not afraid to stand up now, even though you were abused. Your records are going to tell a lot, like your educational records. As we all know, survivors were excellent in school on many occasions. Then when they were sexually abused, at that point in time in life, their grades fell off the table. Many didn't even graduate from high school. And those records will show that your grades fell off the table. You went from A's and B's to D's and F's. Right at that point, when you say you were sexually abused, that's a sign. So do not be afraid of what your records indicate, because they'll in fact help prove the case to you. And of course, what you say in terms of time, place, and person being used once or 150 times, very helpful. You'll be asked the description of the church or where it occurred, or how many priests worked at the church, the description of the abuse, the description of the pedophile priest. And many priests, most priests actually, have strict sexual habits. They abuse child after child after child in a certain way within a certain age range till the child aged out. So those habits, when you're describing the abuse, will help your case too. There are many factors that will help your case, and you just tell the truth and let those factors come out during your case, during your litigation. Again, you don't have to go through this process. If there's an offer, a compensation program, you can get involved in a compensation program, but it's an individual choice. Is it going to help you to see the pedophile priest across the table being abused? Strike that, being deposed. Is it going to help you to see his supervisor across the table being deposed? Is it going to help you to see the records produced supporting your claim? If that's going to help you, then that's the litigation process you want to proceed in. but please understand that the litigation process is very slow and requires an unearthing of your history. And personal is very personal, and it's kept confidential in a lot of ways. We're not allowed to put out there, your history of prior abuse or prior accidents or whatever. It's done in a professional way, but the lawyers for the church are not your friends. They're out to protect the church. They're out to protect these priests. They're out to protect the reputation of these priests in the church. But again, you're letting us stand on your shoulders to end this nonsense. Is the church changing? No, they're not changing their ways. They're talking about changing their ways. They're acting like they're changing their ways, but they're not implementing any programs. They're not being effective. Call the police. Whenever I'm called about a program that put in place it's supposedly put in place by the church, which is never put in place or rarely put in place, I say, just call the police. Whenever I'm called to give a comment about Pope Francis and him saying how bad clergy sexual abuse was and how they've changed, and now they're going to investigate claims, I say, listen, just call the police. You're dealing with an entity, the Catholic Church, which for centuries has allowed the wholesale sexual abuse of children. Then are all of a sudden changing. They're not all of a sudden doing the right thing. They're only protecting themselves. They're a business. You have purportedly the most moral institution in the world acting the most immorally. What is changing is because of survivors coming forward, because of the litigation, because of the compensation programs, and even because of mediations that are going on, the public's awareness that they have to protect children when in the custody of priests, because priests cannot be trusted. I see that time and again, just walking down the street, parishioners who used to think I was doing a bad thing, who thought I was just out to get priests, come up to me now and they say, you're right. Something has to happen. That the priests have to change their ways. And why is that? It's because survivors like you come forward and you allow us to stand on your shoulders. Survivors like you are a voice, and we can proceed with that voice. Survivors like you are providing transparency through litigation. Survivors like you should be so very proud of yourselves. It's an honor to represent you. There are various causes of action that I'm asked all the time about. I'd like to talk about a few of those. There's fraudulent concealment. Fraudulent concealment consists of the church hiding information about a pedophile priest. And when the survivor finds out the church is hiding that information, the clock starts allowing a survivor to proceed with an action if they otherwise can't, because the statute of limitations is gone. Unfortunately, that's a very difficult concept. And the fraudulent concealment rules with regard to a clock starting to allow statute of limitations to open up is different every state. For instance, in Massachusetts, it's miserable. The courts have ruled the survivor should have realized that when there was fraudulent concealment, when they were abused, which doesn't make any sense at all, but that's what we have. In Pennsylvania recently, the highest court determined that a fraudulent concealment claim could not be brought. And even though the lower courts gave it the green light, they said, no, you can't bring it. It doesn't work. And so fraudulent concealment claims differ from state to state. And I'm not saying that the state you're in doesn't allow them, but you have to be very, very careful, because there seem to be a lot of them are being shot down around the country. are not very good to begin with, as I mentioned in Massachusetts. Let me talk about the criminal law just for a minute. I just want to bounce around a little bit. I'm often asked, well, how did you get Cardinal Theodore McCarrick criminally prosecuted in Massachusetts when the sexual abuse happened decades ago? And that's because of the unique law in Massachusetts, and New Hampshire has this law too, and some other states may have, but it only involves criminal law. And that is when a perpetrator leaves the state after abusing a survivor, a child, or anyone, an adult, and they don't live in this state, and that sexual abuser does not live in the state, that perpetrator does not live in the state, and they leave the state, the statute of limitations on the criminal side only stops running until the perpetrator comes back into the state. Then it starts to run for the amount of time the sexual abuser comes back into the state. Then it continues running for the length of time he is within the state. So Cardinal McCarrick sexually abused my client and left the state. And he didn't live within the state. So the clock stopped running. A handful of states in the country have that law. Now, it only applies to criminal actions. And if you want to proceed criminally with regard to the perpetrator, the sexual abuser, you should speak to your lawyer. And of course, you can call me, or if you don't have a lawyer, contact me through my website about prosecuting. I think it's very important that you proceed criminally if it helps you gain validation. It helps you gain a sense of being, a sense that you did nothing wrong, a sense of satisfaction, to rid yourself of that unnecessary guilt or self-esteem or self-respect that I've talked about before. It takes a lot of courage again to proceed criminally, to take that stand. But I thought I'd point that out because I'm often asked about statute of limitations in criminal cases. How do you get Cardinal McCarrick prosecuted when the abuse happened decades upon decades upon decades ago? And that's how we did it in Massachusetts. And I've used this in law in Massachusetts against other big shots from the church too. The Salesians had Father McCormick, I believe. He was, I used that law against him and he got a 10-year jail sentence in Massachusetts. And so there are ways in various states, I won't go into all the states, obviously, but various states have various rules with nuances, with exceptions, with laws that help a person, help a survivor proceed criminally if that survivor wants to proceed criminally. If you report the sexual abuse to criminal authorities, they're usually receptive. In my experience, they're receptive because they want to know about crimes, even if the perpetrator's dead, because maybe somehow they can link in the supervisor. But they want to know about crimes. It's very important. And they're never going to force you to proceed with litigation. They'll always ask you, always, do you want to proceed with litigation? Do you want to just drop this? Do you want to think about it? And they'll advise you whether you can in the first place, of course, because of various issues such as statute of limitations and evidence. But they'll ask you if you want to proceed criminally. And I think it's very important that you understand that, because often I'll be asked, well, if I go to the police, are they going to make me go to the DA? Are they going to make me prosecute? No, they won't. They won't at all. Not in these cases. And your identity will be kept quiet at your request. It will be confidential. It will not be made public at your request. While I'm on statute of limitations, statute of limitations are changing around the country, as I mentioned earlier, because of courageous survivors like you being a voice, being a force, being an energy. And you have to be careful how statute of limitations are changing with regard to your particular case, because in some states, the law is just sweeping And it really, you can prosecute the perpetrator as well as, and the supervisor as well. But in some states, you have to be careful. In Massachusetts, for instance, you can prosecute, you can file a civil complaint against the sexual abuser up until your age 53, before your age 53. That's only against the sexual abuser. Against the supervisor, and this is with child abuse, against the abuse as a child, against the supervisor, you have 7 years from when you realize the sexual abuse caused you harm in life. And that's a vague phrase, and let me talk about it a little bit. You can sue a supervisor within 7 years of you realizing, hey, that's why I have these bad feelings, because the priest sexually abused me. That doesn't mean you have 7 years from when you realize the sexual abuse was wrong. You can remember that your whole life. But the day you realize that that sexual abuse caused you problems in life, maybe problems with anger, maybe problems with alcohol, maybe problems with drugs, maybe problems with suicidal thoughts, that's when the clock starts. In Massachusetts, you can realize that that abuse was wrong, but does not start the clock. Other states where I have many cases like New York, New Jersey, many states, the law is different. The law is you have up until a certain age to sue the supervisors, the church, and the perpetrator. In New York, it's up to age 55. You have that law now. The window is closed in New York, the 2-year window they had, but they still have a law that is a lot better than the law we had in the past. Of course, there should be no statute of limitations in these cases. I'm often asked by various people, how does a person such as a priest defend themselves against a claim which is 40 or 50 or 60 years old? And my response is, and whether it's criminal or civil question, a case involving a criminal or civil case, my response is, in murder cases, there's no statute of limitations. In murder cases, procedural due process and substantive due process defenses work fine. So in these cases where there's child sexual abuse, or sexual abuse, clergy sexual abuse, those defenses, those protections will work fine. After all, it's sole murder with child abuse cases, clergy sexual abuse cases. And I get I never thought of it like that. And I think it's very important that you understand these concepts in determining whether you want to proceed with your litigation, in determining whether you're able to, in determining, in building, getting building blocks so you can proceed. As I mentioned earlier, statute of limitations on the civil side and the criminal side are different from state to state to state. There's no uniform federal statute of limitations. It differs from state to state to state. Of course, on the federal side, we do have child sex trafficking laws, sexual harassment laws, which I use in Haiti. Years ago, I represented over 100 victims of Douglas Perlitz, who received about a 20-year federal prison sentence. He was sexually abusing children in Haiti. In Haiti, children don't have any, adults either don't have any food, don't have any clothing, don't have any shelter, don't have any medicine. They have a lot of disease. On top of the malaria problem, they now have COVID. And of course, we all know about the recent hurricane there, the storm. But I was able to use the sex trafficking laws, the federal sex trafficking laws, because, and we sued And I did this with the great law firm Simmons Hanley out of New York. We were able to show that Douglas Perlitz was affiliated with Fairfield University, the Order of Malta, and the Jesuits, and he was supervised by Father Paul Carrier negligently. And Douglas Perlitz would come to Fairfield University. He was actually their commencement speaker one year, and I'm sure many of you understand how these people how these perpetrators get involved in entities. And he would raise money, and he would be given money, and he was supervised with the Jesuits, and the Order of Malta was involved with the supervision. So we sued in federal court in Connecticut, and we litigated for 7 or 8 years on behalf of these children, and we were eventually successful. We got them over $60 million. These children are forever thankful, and don't think for a second they don't know about your strength and your courage. They see it on social media, and it's empowered them. And they were very young when they came forward, and they're forever thankful that the other survivors are out there pounding the pavement, being a voice, and showing courage. It's very important that we understand that one survivor coming forward helps many survivors coming forward. But getting back to the law, Zach,
I was going to say, Mitch, you've got a bunch of questions in the chat, and
Sure.
far be it for me to try to cut you off, but I was wondering if we maybe could get to some of those really quick. And I just know that first, thank you for your incredible, thoughtful, and helpful presentation. I think it's exactly what we all needed. But let me ask some of these questions. Some are specific, some are more general, but here's one that I think might resonate with other folks. Sue asks, the church paid me a paltry sum a few years ago and had me sign papers that I would never sue them. Is that always binding?
I'd have to look at the paperwork, but it usually is binding. It's a contract, if it's a binding contract, but it may have exceptions in it. You never really know. Unfortunately, that's what they did for a long time. If a person reported sexual abuse to the church, they just throw a small amount of money and say, sign here, and we may or may not give you therapy for the rest of your life.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sue, you can always contact Mitch for more detail. We've got a question from Eduardo who asks, greetings, Mitch. When an allegation of abuse is going before a grand jury, what rights does a victim have? If they bring witnesses into the grand jury for the accused predator, do they not need to call witnesses for the victim?
I wouldn't be too concerned about that, because the grand jury proceeding the standard is very, very low to get someone indicted. And rarely does the predator bring in witnesses because they don't want any evidence out there prior to a trial that the DA can look at. So I would feel very strong. I would listen to your district attorney or U.S. attorney in terms of how to proceed. But the standard is very, very low to indict someone, and it's rare that a person is not indicted. And I'd listen to the DA in terms of whether he or she wants witnesses there on your behalf.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mitch. I really like this question a lot. Could you speak about the possibilities for legal action for those who are abused as adults in the Catholic Church or other institutions? I know many survivors have been turned away by lawyers and other avenues to justice because they were over 18 when the abuse occurred. Do you think we're making progress in understanding the abuse of adults?
We're making progress, but at a snail's pace. The state of New Jersey, to its credit, passed a law allowing adult survivors who were abused as adults to sue under the window. So, there's one state that's made a change. New York State is supposedly considering such a law. And don't forget, if you're abused as an adult, you still can use the statute of limitations, the usual tort statute of limitations, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years. And the example I gave about the criminal statute of limitations tolling in Massachusetts applies to adult abuse too.
That's a great point, Mitch. Thank you for that. Judy asks, how do you find an attorney who has experience in dealing with victims of CSA? She mentions, some of the attorneys that survivors come to, don't always have the ability, aren't as experienced as you, don't have the knowledge that you do. So how can a survivor who's trying to find an advocate for them find one who has the right experience?
I'll give you two answers. The first one is go on the internet and see who's been doing this kind of work for decades. But I really wouldn't trust that because of the advertising. There are many attorneys who aren't experienced. The second one is just contact me and I'll find you an attorney because I know of a network of attorneys. I work with attorneys throughout the country. And, I have cases in California and all over the country. And I have a network of attorneys. So
That is a very kind offer, Mitch. Thank you for that. I'm sure many survivors will be taking you up on that. I think we got time for one more question before the room closes on us. So I'll ask, does litigation get access to things like journals, poetry, and drawings for the past, X number of decades? What if the minister is deceased? Does it help to get consented recordings from adults who were active in the church during the time of the abuse when they became aware of kids being abused?
They plan on the defense being able to get access to all your documents, especially journals, especially drawings. But at the same time, that's very helpful for your case because it's going to reflect the truth. And the truth is you were sexually abused as a survivor. What was the second half of that question? I'm sorry. About recordings?
Yeah, he was asking about, does it help to get consented recordings from adults who were active in the church during the time of the abuse?
Well, what I would do is I would give to your lawyer a list of those names, the names of those adults, and he would or she would have an investigator speak to them and have them deposed. It might be helpful to get recordings, but then again, I would go through a professional. Don't do it on your own. It could get yourself into some kind of trouble. I mean, in many states, for instance, if it's not consented to, it's illegal. So you have to be careful.
That's excellent advice, Mitch. Thank you for that. I think we are out of time. I think the room is about to close, but folks, Mitch has offered to help out with questions that you may have. You can visit him on his website, garabedianlaw.com, and learn more about Mitch's work, what he's doing, and help get some of the answers that you need in your pursuit of justice. Mitch, thank you so much. You are always a pleasure to have, and you have so much experience that makes such a difference for our folks.
Get into therapy if you need it, please. All survivors. Thank you very much, Zach. Thank you for your kind words. It's an honor.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you at the Sound Wash in about 10 minutes.